Hi, all. This is Curt Levey. I'm president of the Committee for Justice, and welcome to the latest in our series of Zoom panels. This one is titled HR 1, Election Fraud and the Future of Voting. At a time post-election when half of Americans believe that substantial irregularities occurred in this November's election, just a few weeks back, the Democrats in the House passed HR 1. It's a wide-ranging elections bill that federalizes elections to a large extent. It's now in the Senate as S1. They say it will protect voting rights and get the money out of politics. Critics, on the other hand, say it would restrict free speech, make it harder for states to determine voter eligibility and otherwise ensure election integrity. One thing we do know is it contains a veritable wish list of progressives' election-related reforms. For example, public financing of congressional campaigns, expanded regulation of campaign and political speech. It would force nonprofits, like several of us come from, to disclose our donors, which would subject them to harassment in today's woke atmosphere. Would allow felons to vote in all states, would get rid of voter ID laws, promote the sort of mass mail-in balloting that we saw in the last election, even when COVID is gone, force states to accept absentee ballots received up to 10 days after the election, as long as they were postmarked by the election, force states to allow ballot harvesting even by campaign staffers, require states to offer election day registration, mandate congressional redistricting by unaccountable redistricting commissions. I could go on and on, but I won't. I'll leave the details for our panel of election law experts, Brad Smith, Jason Snead, Hans von Spakovsky. They'll also discuss what are the prospects for HR 1/S1 passing in the Senate and surviving constitutional challenges. They'll talk about some alternative ways we could improve the election laws. I'll ask them what changes are actually likely to see in future elections and the potential impact of all this on elections and politics. After they give their opening remarks, I'll ask them some questions, and I'll throw in some questions that we've gotten from the audience through the Q&A function or that were emailed to us. So let me introduce the panelists in the order they'll speak. Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation. He's a manager of Heritage's Election Law Reform Initiative. He's a senior legal fellow in Heritage's Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Before joining Heritage about a dozen years ago, Hans was a member of the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission. He's co-author with John Fund of two books, one on election fraud and another on the Justice Department under Eric Holder. He's a graduate of Vanderbilt University School of Law. He is, well, I think I'll stop there. And then following him will be Brad Smith, former chairman of the Federal Elections Commission. He's currently the Blackmore-Nault Professor of Law at Capital University Law School. He's chairman and founder of the Institute for Free Speech. He's author of the book, Unfree Speech, The Folly of Campaign Finance Reform, which George Will called the year's most important book on governance. And he's a graduate of Harvard Law School. And last but not least, Jason Snead. He's the executive director of the Honest Elections Project. Before that, he worked with Hans as a senior policy analyst in Heritage's Meese Center. He was at Heritage for, I believe, 10 years, where he wrote about topics ranging from criminal justice reform to tech policy, in addition to writing about election integrity issues. He managed the development of Heritage's election fraud database, and he holds a master's degree in public policy from George Mason University. With that, let me ask Hans to start it off.
Sure, thanks, Curt. I had to say it's almost like a family gathering since I worked for years with Jason, and I actually took the seat that Brad Smith vacated on the FEC when he resigned. Folks there used to joke that that office was haunted by the ghost of Brad Smith, because I used to vote the same way he did on issues there. Curt, you covered many of the bad provisions of HR 1. And what folks need to understand is that the way this law is written, it's a conglomeration of something like 40 different bills that Democrats have pushed over the years, bills pushed to them by liberal, very radical left-wing advocacy groups. And the intent of all these provisions is to basically destroy the security and integrity of the election process. They eliminate almost every safety protocol that states have put in place. And I'll give you some quick examples, some of which you've already talked about. Look, this would require every state to put in same-day voter registration. That means that states would have to allow you to walk into a polling place on election day, register, and immediately vote. Of course, the problem with that is that election officials in a precinct have no opportunity to verify any of the information you're giving them. Is that really your name? Do you really live where you claim to live? When you combine that with the fact that the law guts voter ID laws, in essence, it tells states they cannot require an ID from anyone. The only thing they can require is that the person sign a form in which they say, yeah, I am who I claim I am. So what that means is I could go to Ohio, walk into a polling place there, register to vote as Brad Smith. They would not be able to ask me for an ID. I would just sign a form saying, yeah, I'm really Brad Smith. And I'd walk out of the polling place. And I could go to the next polling place down the street and claim that and register as Jason Snead, vote again, sign a form saying, yeah, I'm really Jason Snead, and walk out of the polling place. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing election officials could do about this. The same kind of getting rid of basic security protocols with regard to absentee ballots. Not only would states not be allowed to enforce a signature requirement for witnesses. Many states require a witness signature. That's one of the ways to authenticate it was really the voter who filled out and signed the ballot. No ID requirement for absentee ballots, no witness signature requirement for absentee ballots. And 10 days, states would have to allow absentee ballots to come in as long as they're postmarked by election day. Now, that may sound innocuous, but when you combine that, and again, this shows you how the devil's in the details. This law would require every state to prepay the postage on the envelopes that they send to individuals for absentee ballots. Now, that might sound like a good government idea, but what you need to understand is this. No election official is going to lick thousands of stamps and put them on the envelope that they are sending to voters to use to return their ballots. What are they going to do? They're going to postmark it. What do postmarks have on them? They have dates. So that means that the envelope with the postage prepaid that is sent out to voters to use to return their absentee ballot will have the postmark sometimes weeks before election day. Now, if absentee ballots can be coming in for 10 days after election day, what's going to happen? Well, since vote harvesting is made legal, in other words, states have to allow third-party strangers to pick up ballots. Campaign workers, political guns for hire, and others will be going to neighborhoods, fanning out if preliminary results, for example, show that their candidate is losing, going out and trying to collect absentee ballots that were not voted and not sent in. And so the envelopes will already have a date on them of before election day. They can easily collect those ballots and submit them and try to change the outcome of an election. It's just one thing after another like that. There's also all kinds of restrictions put in, making it very difficult for states to clean up their voter rolls, to find people, for example, who are registered in more than one state and are illegally taking advantage of that to cast ballots in more than one state. All of these provisions seem to be intended to make it easy to cheat and easy to manipulate election results. They are extremely unwise, besides the fact that many of them are unconstitutional. We don't have a lot of time, but I'll give you one just quick example of that and then pass it on to Brad, because the campaign finance provisions are just as bad. Look, there's a provision in here that says states have to restore the ability of a felon to vote the moment the felon steps out of prison, even if state law, like in Florida, requires that they first complete probation or parole, or that they first pay restitution they've been ordered to pay to their victims. The problem with that is that the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution specifically gives states the 100% authority to decide if felons will lose their right to vote and when they will get it back. You can't override a constitutional amendment with a congressional bill, and yet that's what H.R. 1 would do. So that's just one example of many of the provisions that are unconstitutional. For folks who want more about this, the Heritage Foundation has put out a fact sheet called The Facts About H.R. 1 Before the People Act of 2021, and it summarizes many of these provisions. So now I'll pass it on to Brad Smith, my predecessor at the Federal Election Commission.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Hans.
All right, well, thank you, Kirk, and thank you, Hans. And Hans, it's okay if you go into the voting booth and vote for me, declare me, because as you point out, they say you vote the same anyway, right? The voting rights provisions of this bill are important. They're very important, and they've gotten most of the attention. But for that reason, I really do want to focus on the First Amendment issues, because I appreciate Hans saying that these are just as important in this bill. 2 days ago, there was a training session held by an ad hoc group called Declaration for Democracy, which appears to be a coalition of a bunch of left-wing groups. Probably would be called dark money if it were a Republican or a conservative organization. In any event, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse spoke there and expressed his belief that S1 would eliminate 2/3 of the speech critical of the left-wing progressive agenda. And then after him came speaker after speaker from organizations on the left, noting that, if they could just pass S1, then you wouldn't have to hear from all these troublesome voices on the right, and it'd be much easier to pass their views. Now, I mean, the good news is that Senator Whitehouse is wrong. It wouldn't silence 2/3 of conservative speech. The bad news is that is the intent, and it would silence a good deal, and is intended to silence conservative voices in politics, and then in the end to create a partisan enforcement mechanism for operating it. Specifically, just to name a few of the provisions, S1 would unconstitutionally regulate speech that mentions a federal candidate or an elected official at any time by a group under a vague standard for promote, attack, support, or oppose the candidate or official. This is a standard that's almost impossible to understand and would probably regulate any mention of an elected official who hadn't announced his or her retirement in advance. The Supreme Court upheld such a standard in 2003, but only as applied to political party speech, where it said, everything a political party does is intended to elect somebody, but not other groups and organizations, civic organizations, trade associations, nonprofits, and so on in society. And of course, the effect of this would be to leave the media, which is exempt from all this, in even greater control of our public discourse and messaging. That wouldn't be a problem, of course, because the media is so straight down the middle and fact-oriented. But there are some people who nonetheless might be troubled by that. It would force groups to file burdensome and probably in many cases duplicative reports with the Federal Election Commission if they sponsor any ads that are deemed to PASO the president or members, PASO meaning promote, attack, support, or oppose the president or members of Congress, to try to persuade those officials to support or oppose policy issues, including legislation, nominees for office. It would require people to state whether their ads are in support of or opposition to the elected official mentioned, even if the ad was neither. It was really an ad just trying to get people to contact folks to urge them to vote in a particular way. It would force groups to publicly identify certain contributors on their reports for ads and on the face of the ads themselves, leaving these contributors subject to harassment campaigns and boycotts, blacklists that have become so common these days. And in many instances, the donors who have to be identified will actually not even have provided funding for the ads. So faced with this prospect of being inaccurately associated with what by law will now be considered, and I think unjustifiably in many cases, campaign ads, many donors are simply going to stop giving to nonprofit organizations, or those organizations will self-censor. Further, it will force organizations that make grants to other groups to file reports publicly identifying their own donors if they, quote, have reason to know that the donee entity might spend money in the next 2 years on campaign-related disbursements. Again, this is going to convince many conservative foundations and so on that it's better simply not to give money to any group that might at some point engage in any kind of political speech. What's interesting about all this is the tremendous cynicism of this bill. And it can be really found in two provisions. It provides for public financing of campaigns. But what's interesting about that is it begins by saying it is the sense of the Senate, right, that no taxpayer money should be used to fund campaigns. Then it immediately sets up a system using taxpayer money to fund campaigns. How does it even put a fig leaf on that? Well, they say this won't be funded by taxpayer money. It will be funded by fines and penalties levied on corporations and the sale of government assets. This is so absurd, but again, it shows the sort of cynicism behind the bill. They know that public financing, government financing of campaigns is unpopular, so they try to pretend that it's not funding those campaigns. But all of us understand that once the U.S. government has money, whether it comes from the sale of assets or a penalty levied on some evil corporation, or whether it comes direct from the income tax or the Social Security tax, it's government money, and they can spend it to fund attack ads or, and subsidize campaigns, or they can spend it on, something warm and fuzzy like, more school teachers or whatever else are the common sacred cows, or they could just give it back to the taxpayers. It's also very cynical. You can get a sense from this, and I've only begun to scratch the surface, that it's going to create a great many more rules and regulations for the FEC to enforce. Well, what the bill then does is change the FEC, which has always been a bipartisan organization, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. You need 4 votes to move. So you need some level of bipartisanship to move forward. They're going to convert that to a 3-2 organization that will be controlled by the president. And this would assure Democratic control of the FEC through the 2024 election and through the 2026 midterms, also the 2022 midterms. So they're pretty determined to keep control. And of course, if they can use this to help win the presidency in 2024, then it will extend Democratic control over the FEC for at least 2 more election cycles. Again, the cynicism here is saying, well, they're going to have 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 1 independent. But of course, 1 independent could be Angus King or Bernie Sanders or anybody like that. I mean, that's the whole idea here, that Biden will appoint that initial independent and they'll be able to keep control, again, at least for the foreseeable future, which will govern most of the campaigns these people would be involved in. As I joked yesterday in testifying to the Senate, I said they're independents and independents. That's why the Republicans control the Senate 50-48. And I was introduced by Chairman Blunt. And then I paused. I said, no, wait, that's not the case, right? Because, of course, there are 2, quote, independents in the Senate, but both caucus with the Democrats, vote Democratic, work with the Democrats, and we all know that game, too. So it's a very cynical bill. It's very bad for democracy generally. It focuses public attention on the individuals and donors associated with sponsoring organizations rather than the message, and thus it exacerbates this politics of personal destruction, further coarsens our discourse, invites people, really kind of encourages people to engage in doxing and bullying in public. It is a bill, if you thought those old timers remember McCain-Feingold, I mean, McCain-Feingold is child's play compared to this. I don't use this kind of language very often. I don't like really extreme, calls to action. This is the death of the republic. This is the 9/11 election or whatever. But I do think this is a hill to die on. What the left, what the Democrats are trying to do here is really outrageous and has to be defeated. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. That's both enlightening and depressing. Let me turn it over to Jason.
Well, thank you. And, I'll say one disadvantage of going last in a panel like this is that I have some tremendously large shoes to fill. We'll start here by talking about some of the constitutional issues, and there are many, and not really enough time to go through them all. But you know, as we've just heard, there are, of course, a tremendous number of policy weaknesses and really bad policies overall in this package. But there are also some constitutional infirmities, and these arise out of the fact that not only does Congress attempt to, through H.R. 1, attempt to micromanage state elections to such a degree, to truly an unprecedented degree, right down to the type of glue used on absentee ballot envelopes. It's also treating presidential and congressional elections identically. And so by doing these things, it's creating an entirely new set of problems above and beyond bad policy and introducing potential constitutional challenges to the fold. So H.R. 1 purports to regulate election for federal office, which is defined not just to include representatives and senators in Congress, but also the president and the vice president. And the key problem with this approach is that the Constitution does not give Congress the authority to regulate all federal elections identically. Congress has significant power over congressional elections, and this can be found in Article 1, Section 4, the Elections Clause, which provides that state legislatures can set the times, places, and manner of holding elections for Congress, but also authorizes Congress itself to make or alter such regulations. Now, contrast that with the Electors Clause in Article 2, Section 1, which reads, quote, Congress may determine the time of choosing the electors and the day on which they shall give their votes, which day shall be the same throughout the United States. So according to this, Congress's termination of the timing is binding on the states. And this was actually a notion supported in a lawsuit that my organization supported last year in Minnesota, a case called Carson v. Simon, where the Eighth Circuit rejected the last-minute modification of Minnesota's ballot receipt deadline by the Secretary of State pursuant to a consent decree. But the Electors Clause itself, beyond the timing, actually clearly gives state legislatures the power to regulate the manner of selecting presidential electors. This arrangement is quite different from the Elections Clause, and that is no accident of history. The framers considered several methods for choosing the president, and at the Constitutional Convention, they deliberately selected one that preserved the independence of the presidency by avoiding legislative control over the selection of the president. There are actually a long series of case law and precedent up to the Supreme Court establishing and affirming that state legislatures have the primary regulatory authority when it comes to governing presidential elections. You can look at McPherson v. Blacker in 1892, Burroughs v. U.S. in 1934, and most recently in 2000 in Bush v. Palm Beach County, which all speak to the basic principle that state legislatures, not Congress and not courts, set the method for selecting presidential electors. Now, H.R. 1, it clearly ignores this basic fact and attempts to regulate all elections to federal office. And it makes no clear distinction between a vote for president and a vote for your congressman or senator. As a practical matter, it also attempts to regulate state and local elections as well, since these races appear on the same ballot. Now, I would argue that this not only runs afoul of the Electors Clause clear limits on the authority of Congress to regulate presidential elections, but it also violates the basic principle of federalism, which puts states first in the regulatory scheme governing our election system. Keeping states in charge of our elections is, contrary to the rhetoric of the left, no relic or stale antique. It's actually, as we all know, a key component for not only our national constitution system writ large, but for our election system in particular. States are able to experiment with new election policies, new methods of voting, new rules and procedures without worry that a failure in one of these experiments will taint an entire national election. Similarly, they are able to learn from the experiences of other states, replicating success where it occurs. It creates a dynamic environment where there is an upward pressure towards success, towards better elections for all voters. And as we are seeing right now, when the public demands action to preserve the integrity of our election system, it is the states that are able to move with far greater swiftness and responsiveness than Congress could ever hope to. And indeed, right now, as we're seeing, states are moving. Numerous state legislatures are considering election reform packages, some of which have already been passed or are nearing passage. And I wanted to take a moment at this point in my few minutes of remarks here to call attention to a report which the Honest Elections Project recently put out. We called it Safeguarding Future Elections. And we wanted to outline in this report 4 state legislatures that are considering election reforms, a series of recommendations and best practices using the successes and experiences of states in a number of arenas. And that report is available online. And our recommendations in that report truly touch on every major aspect of election reform. And we guided ourselves when we were putting this together with one overarching directive, and that is to restore public trust in our election system. It's very clear that that is what voters want as the guiding prime directive for our legislatures right now. And so our proposals not only call for the adoption of voter identification laws for all states for ballots cast in person, but also applying these laws to ballots cast by absentee as well, understanding that as more voters use these ballots, you have to provide for basic security and voter verification. We also call for expediting and simplifying voter list maintenance processes so that we can clear out old or outdated records while, of course, preserving current records for voters. We call on states to ban ballot trafficking by paid political operatives, which is one of the easiest avenues for abuse that we have seen in the election system. And we also outline other process reforms and improvements, all of which are focused on bolstering safeguards to ensure voter confidence and election credibility, while also delivering timely and accurate results. We think that this is absolutely what our legislatures at the state level should be focusing on. Now, that is, of course, a far cry from the direction of H.R. 1, which decries election safeguards as unnecessary and focuses virtually exclusively on making voting, quote unquote, easier. We often hear that such a move is popular and, moreover, is necessary because the only reason to support voter identification laws or some of these other safeguards is, quote, to suppress the vote. But what do voters really think? Which approach do they actually support? Now, we actually just recently wrapped up some polling through our partner organization, HEP Action, asking real voters what they thought. The idea was that we needed to inject a little reality into this debate rather than the narratives which the left is constantly pushing. And what we found is pretty interesting. For starters, the public overwhelmingly backs voter identification requirements, even as Congress is considering restricting them through H.R. 1. 77% of voters want people to show a photo ID when they cast a ballot. Only 14% of people oppose that. And this includes, despite all of the rhetoric that we have seen, this includes majorities of people who voted for Joe Biden in the presidential election. By a 40-point margin, Joe Biden's voters want people to show photo ID. Majorities of Black and Hispanic voters, the voters who are perennially said to be suppressed by these laws, back them by huge margins. In the Black community by 40 points and in the Hispanic community by 60 points. These voters want photo ID laws. And this is true also for low-income voters. Voters also want meaningful protections against fraud. And when we asked to pick between bolstering safeguards to preserve the confidence in elections or removing safeguards to make it easier to vote, by a 3-to-1 margin, American voters selected what you could call the conservative position, that we should be focusing on enhancing the protections for our ballot systems. And finally, I'll mention here before closing that Americans do not want political operatives collecting ballots, quote unquote, assisting voters in casting them, which flies in the face of so many of the other protections that we have when it comes to voting in person at a precinct, where we insist on voter privacy. We handle ballots in bipartisan teams. This removes all of these basic protections and puts paid actors with a vested interest in the outcome of an election in direct possession without supervision of voters' ballots. And it turns out that only 11% of voters think that that is a good idea. So very clearly, despite so much of the rhetoric that we have heard, when you actually ask about some of the policies that are signatures, that are keystones of this piece of legislation, American voters oppose them and want us to go in a direction that, again, you could say would be the more conservative direction on these issues. They want voter ID laws. They want voter ID for absentee ballots. They want additional safeguards. And at bottom, they recognize that the right to vote is about more than just casting a ballot. It's about preserving a fair and honest system, which is also something that they have a right to. And so I will close here, and I'm happy to take any questions, and I appreciate the invitation to speak on this panel today.
Thank you, Jason. And actually, I have a question for you. The media has been throwing around the figure that 2/3 of Americans support HR 1. I guess, is that just a matter of how you phrase the question?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that when they're doing polling and whatnot, they're focusing on particular provisions and they're pushing folks in a particular direction. And I think we actually heard this in the way that it was characterized yesterday in the hearing, where they focus on a couple of things, none of which are that this mandates that states allow ballot trafficking in every community across the country. None of which is that this undermines voter identification laws. None of this is that it expands, mail-in voting while weakening or eliminating safeguards for these already vulnerable ballots. And when we did the polling here, when voters were actually informed about these aspects of the election law, only 28% actually supported final passage of HR 1, which again speaks to the fact that even though they call this the For the People Act, if they do pass it, it will be in spite of the people.
Gotcha. Well, of course, the other side argues that all of these reforms are necessary to prevent voter suppression and get turnout up. But seems to me that in the old days, turnout was as high or higher than it is now, despite the fact that there was no early voting and absentee ballots were only for cause. I'll ask any of you to address that. I mean, how did we get high turnout in the old days without any of these gimmicks, for lack of a better word? Anybody want to take a shot at that? Hans, maybe?
Oh.
Sorry, I had myself on mute. I've just recently been writing about this, so let me take a quick shot at this. Look, the surveys that are done by the Census Bureau after each federal election, they do surveys asking people why they didn't vote. And the idea that is prevalent on the left, which they're constantly pushing, that the reason people don't vote is because it's just too difficult to register, it's too difficult to get to a polling place. That is all completely unsupported by the survey data. The survey data shows that, look, it's easier than ever to register to vote in this country. It's easy to vote, but the survey data shows people who don't vote, the biggest reasons they give is they're just not interested in politics, they don't like the candidates, they don't think it'll make a difference in their everyday lives, and so they just don't go vote. None of that is helped by these procedural changes. In fact, when it comes to early voting, there are a number of studies out there that actually show that apparently early voting may hurt turnout. That these studies, it's counterintuitive, I know, but these studies indicate that states with early voting may have hurt turnout in comparison to states that don't have early voting. No one is quite sure why, but the reason social scientists give that they think it might be is because, remember, campaigns spend a huge amount of money in the last few days before elections in get out the vote efforts. And they speculate that by having to spread out that get out the vote effort over weeks, if not a month and a half, it is not as effective in its intensity, and that may be the reason for it. So, this idea that there's voter suppression going on, that is a complete myth created by the left. It's simply not true. And it is just an excuse that they have made up in order to oppose common sense election reforms like voter ID.
I'll add two things to that if I can. I agree with Hans 100%. And I just wanted to add one additional survey. There is a fantastic survey put out about a year ago by the Knight Foundation. And as it happens, I was actually just pulling it up last night. The number one thing that they list in their executive summary, which was a little bit prescient in some respects, because keep in mind, this was put out in February of 2020. So well before all of the, before COVID even came out. The number one reason that non-voters do not vote is because they have less faith in the electoral system than people who do vote. They believe the system is rigged. It doesn't work for them. They don't like the candidates. Now, if you look at policies in HR 1, which would almost universally open the door to not only greater concerns about fraud, but the opportunity for additional litigation and the introduction of chaos into our election system, that seems like we're running in the opposite direction to what we need to if we're going to try to get these non-voters to participate, because it's not going to give them additional confidence that the system truly is working for them. And the second thing that I'll say here is that, you know, this is really the second election cycle in a row where we have seen historic levels of turnout, where we have seen historic levels of engagement in the minority community, for instance. So much of that is driven not by the laws that govern voting, but by interest in politics, by the engagement of citizens in our civics, right? And yet, for 2 election cycles in a row, the left has become increasingly focused on this argument that somehow we are suppressing the vote. And so I think that this just goes to speak to the fact that there is an increasingly divergent view of elections between what the narrative is and what reality actually is.
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback on that too briefly, Curt. There's, you know, it's so absurd. Let's put it flat out. There have never been fewer obstacles to voting in the United States than there are today. You know, there was not a single state in the country had no-fault absentee voting when Ronald Reagan was first elected in 1980, right? California enacted it within that year, okay? Those of us, you know, who aren't that much older, I don't know how young some of the folks in our audience are, but, you know, we remember, I mean, prior to 2000, there were no provisional ballots. There was no early voting. You know, what are you even early voting, right? I don't even know what that means, was sort of what people would say. So there is a certain absurdity to what's going on. And it's worth noting that if you look at the European democracies, none of them have the kind of ease of no-fault absentee voting or early voting that we have. And it's also worth noting, finally, that, you know, to go back to that popularity question, as Jason Hans indicated, you know, if you ask people a question, hey, HR 1 is a bill to improve voting rights. Do you support it? Everybody says, well, yes. And I also favor the bill for puppies. Okay. But, you know, if you ask people, you know, do you favor even something like early voting, which is shown to be pretty popular? There's pretty strong support for some type of early voting. But if you ask people if they think early voting should be limited to no more than 2 weeks, 14 days, you get a slight plurality say, yeah, that's better than longer early voting, you know? So again, you start taking these individual components of this bill, and as some of them, again, you know, like the public financing of elections is a very unpopular thing, which is why they try to hide it. I think the partisan FEC, if you just ask people, should the FEC be made a partisan group? I think most people say no. And then you get into a lot of the specifics. Voter ID is very popular. The idea that states should be able to limit felon voting is popular. So, you know, again, a broad question, do you favor a voting rights bill? Sure. Who doesn't? Do you want to eat dinner tonight? Sure. Okay. You know, do you want to eat liver? And, you know, well, no, not so much.
I like the way your dog's nose showed up, just as you mentioned.
Show up there
supporting puppies. Ashley often, my colleague Ashley often moderates these, and she has a dog that I adore, Rocky, who his nose often shows up, or his barks in these panels. So that's always a nice addition. Now, Brad, while we've got you, your opening remarks, of course, focused on the free speech aspects, and you said HR 1's you know, a lot worse than McCain-Feingold. Do you think it's part of HR 1 as part of a larger societal crackdown on free speech? I mean, we're definitely seeing that, you know, whether we're talking about you can't mention voter fraud, can't talk about Hunter Biden, you can't say this or that about COVID, and that pattern has accelerated recently. Is this part and parcel with that, or sort of a different track?
No, I do think it's part and parcel that there's just a growing, you know, intolerance of the idea of people saying things that folks don't like. And I think, you know, frankly, I think that intolerance is particularly, not exclusively, but particularly prevalent on the political left. And a lot of them have convinced themselves that their opinions are truth. Facts are opinions, and other people's opinions are lies. And I think that HR 1 is of a piece with that. Here's one little interesting thing that's tucked into HR 1. It would make it would regulate or make it illegal to make deceptive comments about members at one point. And of course, it's interesting to know members can make deceptive comments about you. They can make deceptive comments about your company that you work for, because you figure you're not going to be in their sites. But let's say the company you work for that causes that company's stock to drop by millions of dollars in value. They have to lay off people, or your pension fund assets, if it includes some company stock, goes down there. They can do that. But if somebody makes a deceptive comment about them, they get a new private cause of action. And that's what I mean when we call this the For the Politicians Act.
Jason, let me ask you another question about your organization's report. If I remember correctly, it talked about strengthening the mechanisms for disputing elections, strengthening or clarifying emergency authority over elections. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we actually saw throughout 2020 as COVID first started to become what it became, right? And we got the lockdowns. This was right in the middle of the primary season. And so right from the jump, we were seeing states trying to figure out, how do we navigate this? How do we handle this? What accommodations do we need to make? And then how do we actually, as a question of law, go through that? And we saw some states that handled that quite ably. And made the sort of accommodations that they needed to within the bounds of existing emergency authority in some cases, or legislatures acted in others. But then we also saw some clear examples that I would say were out of bounds, where you saw governors trying to exceed what you would see in the statutory text of emergency authorities to take advantage of the moment to try to weaken, for instance, voter ID laws. You saw more than 200 lawsuits filed by progressive groups, ranging up to and including the DNC itself, trying to force additional changes through the courts. And you saw courts too often stepping into this fray and trying to make policy judgments about what states needed to be doing. And so a lot of what we focused on in this report here was trying to clarify, so that in the event of future emergencies like natural disasters, you have the ability to make reasonable changes to our elections, but not so much so that you can just wipe away with the stroke of a pen all of the basic safeguards that guarantee the integrity of the process, and also ensure that legislatures have the ability to ensure that the laws that they draft are not being undercut in courtrooms through consent decrees, which was something that we saw a lot of, where the left would sue a friendly attorney general or secretary of state, and then that person would simply agree to promulgate a new set of regulations in direct contravention of established law, for instance, to extend the ballot receipt deadline for absentee ballots. So that's a very important thing, I think, for folks to be focusing on in states, is making sure that we can respond when needed without undercutting the integrity of the law.
Thanks, Jason. Brad and Hans, do you have anything to add to what kind of changes you'd like to see with or without HR 1 passing, with a focus on how can we prevent a repeat of the 2020 election?
Well, in fact, the Heritage Foundation put out a fact sheet on February 1st. It's 7 pages of our best practices recommendations. It's basically a series of bullet points telling states that here's how we think they should handle voter registration, absentee ballots. It caught the attention of the New York Times, which did a hit piece on us earlier this week, because they don't like the best practices recommendations. What was actually funny about that was that they blamed our best practices recommendations and claiming that this new law just passed in Arizona actually followed our recommendations, and that it's a restriction of voting rights because, horror of horrors, the Arizona law requires state election officials to compare the voter registration list with state death records. apparently that's restricting the voting rights of people who are dead. But that's the kind of criticism we're getting from the left for doing that. If I could just add one thing on what Brad was talking about, the requirements for disclosures that are in this bill, particularly for membership organizations, whether frankly you're on the right, you join the NRA, or you're on the left because you support abortion rights and support NARAL, for example. I will tell you, I believe that these are the modern equivalent of the kind of disclosure requirements that the state of Alabama tried to impose on the NAACP in the 1950s. You know, that case, NAACP versus Alabama, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And what was happening then was that the state government was very unhappy about the individuals who were supporting the civil rights movement. And so Alabama tried to put in these same kind of disclosure requirements that would have required nonprofits like the NAACP to disclose their donors. And the whole intent of that was to be able to subject them to harassment, intimidation, so the support would dry up for those organizations. This is the modern equivalent of that. And in some ways, that kind of intimidation has gotten easier because of modern technology and the social media platforms that allow donors and members of these kind of organizations to be harassed and intimidated. And as Brad says, blacklists started to try to make sure they lose their jobs and otherwise are unable to function because they don't fit within what is considered the political orthodoxy. And this bill takes us a long way down that road. And that's just another reason why I hope it does not become law.
Brad, are there any other changes you'd like to see?
Well, you know, one could come up with a lot of specific changes. Hans has named a few on the administration side. You know, also we've talked some on the speech side. I think generally we simply need to be going the opposite direction on the speech side, deregulating, focusing more on the message, less on trying to set it up so that people can be doxxed on the internet. So, you know, my changes would be almost all stop doing what you're doing and just think about doing the opposite, right? But I want to raise one small point there, which is too, that we need to bear in mind. There's sort of a perception, at least what the media promotes nowadays, of course, is that, you know, Republicans all think that Trump won and this is, and they're just not connected to reality and so on. And they don't know what's going on in elections. What's very interesting is if you look at polling, the percentage of Democrats who believe that Hillary Clinton won in 2016 is essentially, you know, within a couple points of the Republican percentage that think that Trump won. You've got the same kind of dynamics there. You've got a huge percentage of Democrats who believe that Russians actually altered the vote totals in 2016. Prior to the 2020 election, a poll was taken and Democrats were almost as likely as Republicans to say if they lost, it would be due to vote fraud committed by the other side. So the big point is that this is you know, a big elephant in the room. People don't trust our election results. And that's a really dangerous thing. And the question is, do you resolve that by making sweeping changes, more chaos, doing a lot of things that people, you know, don't really relate to the integrity of the elections, like mandating that felons be allowed to vote, right? And doing a lot of things that, you know, let's assume voter fraud isn't a big problem, right? Still, do you want to be removing restrictions on that? Do you want to be doing things that make it easier for someone to cheat if they want it to cheat? That's one of the, you know, the kind of real problems we have here. And are you going to restore confidence in elections by trying to have people doxxed, making people afraid to speak their mind in public, by putting more restrictions on, you know, what you can say, more regulations, and then having it all enforced by a partisan election commission rather than a bipartisan body? And so I think in that respect, you know, this bill not only ignores the really crucial issue facing American elections, which is simply the loss of legitimacy, but makes it much worse.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Not just today, I agree wholeheartedly with that. That's absolutely right.
Let me ask you all this. Putting aside the more grandiose claims of election fraud in this last election, if the sort of modest reforms that all three of you are suggesting had been in existence and enforced, might it have made a difference either in the presidential election or the Georgia Senate races? or anywhere on the ground?
Well, the problem is we don't know. Look, one of the problems with last year's election is that, look, there were a lot of claims made, a lot of affidavits, sworn affidavits by witnesses and voters submitted in lawsuits that were filed in places like Georgia and elsewhere, and they were never, that wasn't resolved. You know, courts dismissed almost all these cases on procedural grounds, citing lack of standing, et cetera. Frankly, it would have been a lot better for us and for the nation and for the public if, in fact, those cases had proceeded to the substantive substantive area where judges actually investigated it, where there were hearings held to determine, you know, was there any credibility or was there no credibility to the claims that were being made? But because these were dismissed on procedural grounds, this is going to remain out there as a question in the minds of many people. It actually, I think, would have been much better for these cases to have proceeded and for final determinations to have been made. Look, if the cases had all been investigated, and particularly the claims and the witnesses examined, and the final judgment of the courts were, well, there wasn't anything to it, well, then we wouldn't have this question hanging out there. It might have gone the other way. We just don't know.
I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in, but actually this would be a good time. An audience member asks, would there have been a better way for Trump and his supporters to contest the election? So I don't know whose fault it is that these questions didn't get addressed, but would there have been a better strategy for forcing the courts to address these issues and the litigation that, for the most part, was thrown out?
Well, I'll state my opinion, which is, I don't think there's any reason to believe that there was fraud on the kind of level that would have changed the election results. Right? I feel pretty confident about that. I understand that some smart people disagree with me, and maybe even here on our panel, but that's my take on it. One of the things that I think is a real problem is that a lot of the things that people didn't like were done legally. That is, for example, courts came in and changed rules to say, well, you don't have to have your ballots postmarked before the election or received by election day. I think any law that doesn't require absentee ballots to be received by election day, to me, is problematic, because obviously once election day comes, people start knowing, here's how many votes I need, here's where I need them. And it really sets up a scenario where both people have an incentive to commit fraud, the ability to commit fraud, and others will suspect that some might be committing fraud. And that's a real problem there. And that's a lead in to say that one thing I wish would happen, and I'm not sure something you can legislate so easily, but courts should be much more reluctant to step in and feel like they have to step in to an election. To take it out of 2020, I think a lot of us here have for years wondered how it is that, there's always some judge somewhere who orders the polls open for an extra 2 hours or something. And I'm not saying the judges are being corrupt or anybody's corrupt or changed the rules, but it leaves everybody wondering, what's up with that? I mean, I thought if you were in line when the polls closed, then you could vote. So, let it go. We had a case in Ohio where a federal judge ordered the polls to stay open based on getting anonymous phone calls into her office saying there'd been a big traffic accident on I-75, which there had been, and therefore we were going to leave the polls open. Now, the Sixth Circuit eventually wrote an opinion saying, you can't do that. Don't ever do that again. But the thing is, on election day, there's no appeal before election day is over. There's no time to get it done. And I think, state and local judges need to be much more reluctant to step in and feel like, they have to do this. And one of the great things we should remember about elections is if there are some irregularities and so on, we should all calm down. One of the great things about our country is we're going to have another election. We have elections this year that will start to be a referendum on the Biden administration, and midterms next year, and a presidential election, in a couple of years. So everybody sometimes needs to realize that we're not going to have a perfect election. And this pursuit of a perfect election, I think it creates this chaos in this environment in which people feel like, even whether it's true or not, and it may be true, it may not be, but people feel like there's a lot of play in the joints and room for operatives to manipulate things. And I think this creates this erosion of trust in election results.
No, see, I actually agree with that. I mean, I agree with Brad on all of that. And the place where mistakes and errors and fraud can make a difference is in close elections. And the problem is we have close elections all the time, particularly at the state and local level. And that's what we need to try to deter and make sure that those kind of problems don't occur. And where we really need to worry about it, like I said, is in close elections. And that is the real issue in this whole area.
I agree with that too. And one other thing that I often point to about why this is so important, particularly on the question of what role courts have in this. You saw so much litigation before the election in the primaries and in the general trying to change voting rules. And oftentimes this was presented as we're just trying to make voting easier. But if you actually look at what the rules were that were being changed and what the potential impact could have been, for instance, in Minnesota, one of the lawsuits extended the ballot receipt deadline past election day, which was what was written into state law, and also said that you don't need to have a postmark on these ballots that shows that they were in fact cast before election day in order to count. Now, this ultimately didn't have an impact on the election, but imagine this sort of scenario. Imagine if it is a close race. It's down to a few thousand votes, and the decisive ballots are technically illegal under state law, but are being counted because of a court order brought in a partisan lawsuit. And that sort of scenario could repeat itself in future elections where it is decisive. It happened in Pennsylvania, went up to the Supreme Court, and I really wish that the Supreme Court had taken the opportunity to actually take that case and consider some of these questions so that we can have clear, decisive rules going forward into 2022 and beyond about what is and is not out of bounds in the course of courts involving themselves in elections.
Of course, the suggestions that you've all made are very much at odds with HR 1. Is there any slimmed down version of HR 1 that you think could get bipartisan support, and in which case it would be enacted?
I haven't seen a single provision in the bill that was good. I mean, every single one of them to me is bad, but not just on the election administration area, but in the campaign finance area, the provisions are all just atrocious.
Yeah, I can't think of anything to go out on a limb for.
All right. Well, sounds like either the Democrats will have to get rid of the filibuster if they have any chance of passing this, and even then, I assume the odds are not great. Let me try to work in, we've only got a few minutes. Let me try to work in another audience question. We haven't talked about redistricting commissions. They're a little bit tangential to what we've talked about, but they're a very important part of this bill. The audience member asks, given that both parties can gerrymander, why is it that the Democrats seem to be so fearful of gerrymandering and so in love with redistricting commissions? And that's a question for any of you.
Well, I think part of it is that what we find is that these sort of nonpartisan commissions tend not to actually be nonpartisan. For a variety of reasons that we can guess at, but I think we are guessing, they tend to come under the control of activist liberals. I think it really comes down to it. So I think that's something, we've seen that with like judicial selection committees in states and so on. So I think we're just better off. We've had gerrymandering for a long time. There's a self-check on it. And the process of political redistricting is inherently political, right? You're going to have to make choices as to how you're going to cut the districts up. And I think it's better to have it done by politically accountable bodies.
Yeah, that is really true. The idea that these independent commissions are actually independent is a misnomer. And in fact, there was a great study done not too long ago by the Capital Research Center where they took a look at the congressional districts that were drawn up by the supposedly independent California Redistricting Commission, and they compared it to the congressional districts drawn up by the Republican-controlled legislature of Texas. And the California Independent Redistricting Commission actually drew more partisan districts than the Republicans in Texas. And the big factor that voters should keep in mind is this. If you don't like the way state legislators have drawn up districts, you could try to vote them out of office. They're accountable to voters. The members of these commissions are not accountable to voters. They're appointed. You get mad or angry about what they're doing. There's nothing as a voter you can do about it. And that's why it is such a bad idea to take this away, I think, from state legislators.
Yeah, I think there's a rather cynical sort of core to this. I think if you're a Democrat, you're seeing Republicans did very well on down ballot races in 2020. Republicans actually earned a few more trifectas in the states, control more state legislatures. And if I'm a voter sitting in one of these states and I'm watching this go down, what I'm essentially seeing is, we sent folks to our state capitals to control this process. And now folks in Washington don't like that we did that. So they're trying to take that power away from the representatives that we elected. And I think that is ultimately sort of the cynical strategy that is at the heart of this.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I want to thank the three panelists. I thought it was a great panel, and that would not have been possible had we not had three great guests who I think explained this very well and and know their stuff. So thank you very much to the panelists. We do these panels frequently, so tune in again soon for another interesting topic. Take care, all.